How is experience realized in the natural world? We know what it feels like to have sensations, and we've discovered the correlations in the stuff of the mind, the brain. But etching out the explanation in between has been a problem.
In order to bridge the gap, in order to go from simply saying that this chunk of brain is associated with this psychological function, in order to really explain away the miracle, explain how it is that brain tissue can result in thought, intelligence, perception, we have to crank up the microscope to the level of neurons and neural computation, because that is the level of analysis in which the ultimate explanation for our thoughts are to be found.
The use of computation here is attempting to connect two very different worlds.
We seem to have these facts about the universe that are mental. I see redness, I feel pain, and yet we assume that under a physicalism that these mental events must be realized in physical events, presumably neuronal activity.
So the challenge is to understand what these smaller parts are doing together in order to get experience at the other end. On the right is a study the images, the connections made by a single neuron, appearing in red, in a tiny, tiny volume around only part of its cell body. The so far most influential framing that tries to describe the functions of these connections is that of so-called neural networks.
The title of the lecture was From Neurons to Consciousness, and I promised to show you how properties of neural networks that we can detect physiologically can actually explain aspects of your consciousness.
Besides the physical detection of the parts, our model of neurons will also have to etch out the feel of conscious experience.
So there's different parts to the mind-body problem. One is, how can mental events be causal when they're realized in physical events? And if physical events are sufficient to explain causation, then what role are they playing? The other part is how mental events are realized. How is consciousness realized in neuronal events?
The way we frame phenomena such as neuronal activity changes the ideas we can have about it. In the case of neural networks, it limits how we can think about neurons. Here, they're framed as simple input mechanisms, and not much else is needed to create the outputs in the model.
And the general way in which scattered patterns of input can be transformed into some coherent output that stands for something in the world, in this case something as simple as a line, is the subject matter of the branch of neuroscience sometimes called neural computation or neural networks.
It's from this basis, where each neuron is activated by a piece of something in the world, that computation in networks is conflated to model the computation of cognition. Except the networks only describe how inputs might be put together, and nothing about the nature of those inputs, much less about how any precursor to experience may exist at the level of neurons.
Even the best cognitive architectures that have been developed so far in cognitive science have tended to be too disciplined, too neat, to not have the sort of unruly competition that I think now is essential in an actual organic brain, especially a human brain.
So then if networks are failing to capture the activity of neurons, what kind of computation is it that these models can accomplish? And what allowed them to get so tangled up with our ideas of cognition?
What I consider one of the great discoveries in the history of thought, in the 1940s, two neurologists named Walter McCulloch and Roger Pitts showed how you could actually compute logical functions, the kind that go all the way back to Aristotle, if neurons were wired together in particular ways. Now, I think a lot of logicians would say, you give me the ability to compute logical functions, I will give you all of intelligence.
But we've had these models of the brain ever since the McCulloch-Pitts neurons, which was one of the great oversimplifications of all times that came along. I can't remember the year right now, but it was in the 50s, I think.
It was great for logical functions, but it wasn't immediately obvious what kinds of things were left out. Networks would have worked out great if each neuron really did represent a singular idea or a concept and merely turned on or off in combination together to represent an experience.
There is some superficiality that looks similar. In a neuron, you have a spike of electricity either happening or not at any given moment, and that's sort of like a digital thing. It may or may not have some gradation, but when it happens at the same level. So you have sort of a digital response, and that does seem similar to a digital.
Yes, and if you go back and look at some of the original papers from the 1940s, McCulloch and Pitts are often referred to as for inventing neural information processing. And they looked at neurons and they said, oh, and they did real experiments with neurons, famous papers that they were involved with real biological systems, but they abstracted that away to logic gates. And that was the level of their metaphor.
That was a brilliant simplification, and they're wonderful little thinking tools, but brains aren't like that.
Understanding the nature of brain has been the missing step between the inputs of the external world and the processing that creates the sensations of conscious experience. Our computational models so far have relied on selling neurons short, but as we look to the explanatory gaps that remain, we're forced to reevaluate the bases we thought we had.
In fact, the famous British mathematician Turing, who is responsible for our current models of computation, looked at those models, and unfortunately his life was cut very short in 1954, but he was looking at some of those models and saying, this isn't quite enough. There's more to neurons. But we went into this computational approximation, which McCulloch and Pitts knew was an approximation, but I think the students who followed sort of took that and ran with it, and then the models got more complex, but I think we got led astray.
Right, and so my field of neuroscience, cognitive neuroscience, is reaching sort of the limits of knowledge. We don't know the neural code or the neural codes. We don't have a deep understanding of the neural basis of consciousness, and we don't have a deep understanding of how mental events can be causal in the universe. So there's lots to do yet.
Looking to the next step of how we frame biological systems, there is a subtle notion emerging that there is something like experience and autonomy in the parts that make us up.
These are neurons in a dish, and you see they're putting out their little dendritic graspers and looking around. And here's another one. Is it going to make that connection? No, yes, no. So I want you to replace the image you have of a McCulloch-Pitts neuron with these squiggly little agents by the billions gathered in your brain and faced with the task of keeping life and limb together for you.
It's by our new imagining of biological systems that it seems as if the parts are much more consistent with the whole, in the sense that our cells and organs are subject to their own kinds of experience as they navigate and survive in their environments. It's this notion that is at least blatantly absent from the descriptions we attempt to complete.
I'm going to be making an assumption here which I'm not going to defend, and which itself could be the topic of not one lecture but many courses, and that is that consciousness consists of patterns of information in neural networks in the brain. And I'm not going to explain how you make the leap from neural activity to the subjective experience of an entity, just to show you how when the information changes due to properties of the wiring of your neural networks, your consciousness changes.
And here we arrive at information. What is the nature of this which goes on to be patterned by networks? It's not going to be an on or off signal by neurons, but something more alive. Something produced by bodies as they move through and react to environments. And it's information now that is being used by naturalist thinkers in their articulations of mind and universe. It's appearing to be inherent to experience, manifested differently and special across the bodies, environments, and systems that process it. Information occupies a place in nature, and it's the exploration of this space that will be the subject of the video series.